The restaurant was quiet, upscale, and filled with the soft glow of candlelight. It was the kind of place where you felt safe and pampered. My husband and I were halfway through dessert, sharing a decadent chocolate cake, when a waiter arrived to clear some plates. He was quiet and professional, but as he placed the check down, he subtly slid a folded napkin into my lap. I felt the paper brush against my leg and looked up, but he was already moving away. I unfolded it under the table, my heart fluttering with a strange curiosity. It contained 4 simple words. "Watch your husband tonight." I glanced up quickly, trying to find the waiter in the crowded room. When I caught his eye, his expression wasn't mischievous or playful. It was urgent, almost desperate. I looked back at Adrian, who was sipping his wine, looking relaxed and loving. I told myself the waiter must have misunderstood something or was perhaps playing a cruel prank. I told myself that strong marriages like ours don't get shaken by anonymous notes from strangers. I folded the note back up and slipped it deep into my purse, trying to forget it. That was the exact moment I failed myself. I chummed for truth. Months later, I would be standing in a courtroom, watching that same smile again. The bank notification lit up my phone while my husband stood in front of the judge, looking like the perfect wronged spouse. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the bright screen in the dim courtroom. The numbers were staggering. $482,000 seized. My hands went numb, and the phone nearly slipped from my fingers. That notification was the result of everything that unfolded in that very room. The criminal evidence, the forensic records, the judge's orders, the full weight of what we had built and what he had tried to steal, finally being recovered by the law. I looked up, blinking back tears of relief mixed with rage, as his lawyer calmly slid a heavy stack of papers across the wooden table. These documents claimed I had voluntarily given up my entire ownership in our company exactly 3 months ago. 3 months ago was our anniversary. "That signature is hers," the lawyer said with a smooth, oily voice that made my skin crawl. I looked at Adrian, waiting for him to defend me, to say it was a mistake, but he didn't even look at me. Instead, he just sat there and smiled. It was that same quiet, controlled, and chilling smile he had worn at the restaurant, the night I had ignored the only warning I was ever going to get. My name is Naomi Sinclair, and until 3 months ago, I believed I was living a dream in a stable, loving marriage. I wasn't just Adrian's wife. I was his partner in every sense of the word. Together, we co-founded Sinclair Urban Developments. I wasn't a silent partner, sitting on the sidelines. I built the marketing arm of that company from the ground up with my own sweat and late nights. I was the one who handled the difficult investors, and I was the one who negotiated the contracts that kept us afloat. I trusted Adrian with everything, my heart, my future, and my daughter's security. That trust extended to that final, fateful night at the restaurant. I thought the anniversary dinner was a romantic celebration of how far we had come as a couple. I thought the flowers and the soft music were signs of his enduring affection. I never could have imagined that the dinner was actually the beginning of the end. It was a carefully staged performance, designed to end my life as I knew it. Looking back, the signs were all there, hidden behind his handsome face and expensive suit. I just chose to see the man I wanted him to be, instead of the predator he actually was. After dinner was finished, Adrian leaned across the table and took my hand. He told me he had one small surprise left for the evening. My heart leaped, thinking maybe it was jewelry or a trip we had discussed. Instead, he pulled out a folder of paperwork from his jacket pocket. "It's just some boring stuff for the business," he said, his voice smooth and reassuring. "I'm restructuring some shares for tax efficiency to protect us and our daughter's future." He handed me a silver pen, the light from the candle reflecting off its surface. I didn't read the documents fully. Why would I? I trusted him more than I trusted anyone else in the world. I ignored the nagging memory of the note in my purse because I wanted the night to stay romantic and perfect. I didn't want to ruin the mood by being a suspicious business partner instead of a loving wife. I smiled at him, felt a rush of gratitude for how he looked out for us, and I signed my name on the lines he pointed out. As the ink dried on the paper, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not love, but a dark, sharp triumph. I brushed it off as my imagination, but the trap had already snapped shut around my ankles. The next morning, the romantic glow of the previous night had completely vanished. Something felt deeply off. Usually, Adrian and I spent our mornings talking over coffee, but today he was distant and cold. He was checking his phone constantly, his thumbs flying across the screen with an intensity I hadn't seen before. Several times, he stepped outside into the garden to take calls, speaking in a low, hurried voice that cut off the moment I came near the window. When I finally confronted him and asked what was wrong, he didn't even look up from his device. He just gave me a tight, artificial smile. "You're overthinking again, Naomi," he said dismissively. That word, again, hit me like a physical blow. He had started using it a lot lately, always whenever I noticed a discrepancy in our accounts or a change in his behavior. It was a subtle way of telling me that my observations weren't based in reality, that I was the problem. I went to the kitchen and tried to shake the feeling, but the silence in the house felt heavy and full of secrets. I reached into my purse and felt the crinkle of the waiter's note. For the first time, the words, "Watch your husband tonight," didn't feel like a prank. They felt like a prophecy I was already living. 2 days later, the first real blow landed. I was checking our joint household account to pay for our daughter's school trip when I saw it. A massive sum of money had been moved out of the account just hours before. It wasn't a normal bill or a business expense I recognized. When I confronted Adrian about it that evening, he didn't look surprised or guilty. He didn't even stop scrolling through his tablet. He calmly walked over to his desk and showed me a specific clause in the document I had signed at the restaurant. "It's a temporary liquidity redistribution," he said, using that cold, legal language that made my head spin. His voice was devoid of any warmth or the loving husband persona he had displayed just 48 hours prior. He explained that since I had signed over the controlling interest, he had the right to move assets as he saw fit for the health of the firm. For just a moment, one single fleeting moment, he looked at my face, really looked at it. Something shifted behind his eyes, something almost human, a recognition of what he was doing to me. Then it was gone, sealed back behind the glass, as if he had made the decision all over again in real time and chosen the same answer. He spoke with a strategic precision that made me realize this wasn't a sudden decision. He had planned every move, every word, and every signature. I stood there in our beautiful living room, surrounded by the life we had built, and realized I was standing in a house owned by a man I no longer knew. The redistribution was just the beginning of my erasure. As the days went on, the gaslighting became a daily occurrence. Every time I questioned a missing file, a weird charge on our credit card, or why our regular investors were suddenly avoiding my calls, Adrian turned it back on me. "You've been so stressed lately, Naomi," he would say with a sigh of fake pity. "You're imagining patterns where there are none." When I reminded him of promises he had made about the business, he would look at me with concern and say, "You don't remember things clearly anymore. Maybe you should see someone." The more he said these things, the more I actually started doubting my own sanity. I found myself checking the dates on my calendar 5 times a day. I wondered if I had misunderstood the note from the waiter, or if the waiter had even been real. Was I being paranoid? Was my work stress finally causing me to break down? I would look in the mirror and see a woman who looked tired and frayed, which only served to reinforce Adrian's narrative. He was painting a picture of a wife who was losing her grip, and he was using my own confusion as the brush. I felt like I was drowning in a sea of his lies, and every time I tried to swim to the surface, he pushed my head back under. The weight of the doubt became too much to bear, so I decided to find the one person who had tried to warn me. I went back to the restaurant on a Tuesday afternoon, hoping to find the waiter. The dining room was empty and bright, a sharp contrast to the night of our anniversary. I waited for the manager and described the man who had served us, the quiet one with the urgent eyes. The manager looked at me with a blank expression, though I noticed his eyes dart briefly to the side before he answered, as if checking whether anyone else was listening, and claimed no one by that description was on their staff roster, permanent or temporary, for that evening. I felt a chill run down my spine. I asked to see the security footage from that night, offering any excuse I could think of. The manager gave a frustrated shrug and said there had been a system glitch that specific night, and all the files were corrupted. It was as if the waiter had never existed at all, a ghost in a white apron. That's the moment when my fear finally replaced my doubt. This wasn't just a husband acting strange. This was a coordinated effort to erase the truth. If Adrian could make a person and a video recording disappear, what else could he do? I walked out of the restaurant into the bright sunlight, but I had never felt more alone or more hunted in my entire life. I knew I couldn't go home and pretend anymore. I needed professional help that Adrian couldn't track. I hired a private attorney quietly, using a small inheritance from my grandmother that was in a separate account he hadn't touched yet. I met her in a small, cramped office across town. She was sharp and didn't waste time with pleasantries. I gave her copies of the documents Adrian had made me sign, which I had managed to photograph when he left his briefcase open for 5 minutes. She reviewed the signed documents with a focused scowl, but then her face went pale. She looked up at me, and I could see the pity in her eyes. "Naomi, this doesn't just restructure shares for tax reasons," she said softly. "By signing this, you completely relinquished your controlling interest in Sinclair Urban Developments. You gave him total power." I felt the room tilt on its axis. My lungs felt like they were collapsing. I hadn't just signed a boring business form. I had handed over my life's work to a man who was currently trying to convince the world I was crazy. I realized then that the note hadn't been about Adrian having an affair. It was about something far worse. A cold-blooded financial assassination. Before I left her office that day, we agreed that I would also need a forensic accountant, someone who could dig through the company's financial records and find the proof we needed to fight back. My lawyer kept flipping through the pages, her brow furrowed as she scanned the fine print. She stopped near the end and pointed to a section titled Secondary Contingencies. Buried deep inside the agreement, in language so dense it was designed to be overlooked, was a clause tied to my financial instability. The clause stated that if I became legally volatile, irrational, or was deemed unfit due to mental health struggles, Adrian could automatically petition for primary custody of our daughter and take over my remaining personal assets. It was a masterpiece of legal cruelty. It was strategic, calculated, and predatory. Everything he had been doing, the gaslighting, the comments about my memory, the system glitches, was designed to trigger this specific clause. He wasn't just trying to take the company, he was trying to take my child. He was building a cage for me, and he had used our anniversary dinner to get me to walk inside and lock the door myself. I sat in that lawyer's office and felt a rage so cold it turned into a sharp, icy clarity. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was a mother whose child was being used as a pawn in a billionaire's game. The time for crying was over. The time for survival had begun. I went home that night and didn't hide my anger. When I confronted him this time, the loving husband mask didn't just slip. It shattered completely. Adrian didn't bother to deny anything. He didn't smile his fake, comforting smile or try to tell me I was overthinking. Instead, he leaned back in his leather chair, crossed his legs, and looked at me with a terrifyingly blank expression. "You should have watched me, Naomi," he said, his voice as cold as a winter grave. My stomach dropped into my shoes. He knew about the note. He had seen the waiter give it to me, or perhaps he had orchestrated even that, just to see whether I would trust him over a stranger's warning. He watched me with the eyes of a man who had already won. He told me that I had no proof, no allies, and no way out. He told me that everyone already thought I was losing it, and that any move I made would only prove him right. Seeing him like that, stripped of his charm, and showing the monster underneath, was the most terrifying moment of my life. He was a man who had calculated the cost of our marriage and decided that the profit was worth more than my soul. The isolation began almost immediately after that confrontation. It was like a silent wall was being built around me. Friends I had known for years stopped calling or returning my texts. Even Maya, my oldest friend, the woman who had been my maid of honor, who knew me before I was ever a wife or a co-founder, went quiet. I had called her twice. She had read the messages and said nothing. Investors I had personally courted for Sinclair Urban Developments suddenly withdrew from scheduled meetings, citing internal shifts. I started hearing whispers through the grapevine, rumors that I was having a mental breakdown, that I was unstable, and that I was the reason the company was struggling. Adrian was planting these seeds everywhere, talking to our social circle with a look of deep concern for his troubled wife. He did it quietly and systematically, making sure that, by the time I reached out for help, everyone would already be primed to dismiss me as irrational. I would walk into a room and the conversation would stop. I would see people exchange knowing, pitying looks. It was a psychological warfare tactic designed to make me feel completely alone, and it was working. I was being erased from my own life, replaced by a ghost story Adrian was telling. Every person who turned away from me was another victory for him, and I could feel the walls of the cage he built closing in tighter every single day. Then one evening, my daughter padded into the kitchen in her pajamas and looked up at me with those wide, honest eyes. "Mummy," she said softly, "why does Daddy smile all the time now but you never do?" I held it together just long enough to tell her everything was fine. Then I turned to the sink so she wouldn't see my face, and I gripped the edge of the counter until my knuckles went white. She was 7 years old. She wasn't supposed to be carrying any of this. Despite the isolation, my lawyer and I didn't stop digging. We knew Adrian was smart, but even the smartest men leave a paper trail when they are greedy. After weeks of scouring public records and internal audits, I had managed to slip out of the office. My lawyer finally found something. It was a secondary holding company, registered under a name I didn't recognize, but with a mailing address that was a P.O. box Adrian had used years ago. This company had been created 6 months prior to our anniversary dinner. It wasn't just a tax shelter, it was a vacuum. Adrian had been siphoning assets, cash, property rights, and even some of our smaller subsidiaries into this hidden company slowly and carefully. He hadn't just decided to betray me on our anniversary. He had been preparing his exit for half a year. He had been sleeping next to me, kissing me goodnight, and planning our daughter's bedtime stories, all while he was actively dismantling our life together. The level of premeditation was chilling. It wasn't a crime of passion or a sudden mistake. It was a long-term, cold-blooded heist of our entire life. Finding that account gave me the first real weapon I had, proof of his intent. Just when I thought I was at a dead end with the waiter, an anonymous email arrived in my personal inbox late one night. There was no subject line, just one attachment. I opened it with trembling hands, and a short video clip began to play. It was the waiter from the restaurant. He was in what looked like a back alley, speaking to someone off camera whose face was hidden in the shadows. "She deserves to know," the waiter said, his voice shaking with fear. Then a familiar voice responded, the voice that had haunted my dreams. It was Adrian. "You were paid to serve food, not warn her," Adrian said, his tone sharp and dangerous. The video cut out there. It was the missing piece of the puzzle. The waiter wasn't a member of the restaurant's regular staff at all. Adrian had hired him privately as an outside contractor through a third-party fixer, someone he used for tasks he preferred kept off the books. The waiter had been brought in only to play a supporting role that evening, but in the process, he had overheard far more of Adrian's plans than he was ever meant to. He hadn't been hired to warn me. He had been hired to help create the perfect setting, but his conscience had gotten the better of him. Unable to live with what he had been part of, he had likely sent this video himself, using the cloak of anonymity to finally do right by me. This footage proved that Adrian knew about the warning and had actively suppressed it. It proved the restaurant dinner wasn't a romantic gesture. It was a legal ambush. He needed me in a public setting, relaxed by alcohol and soft lighting, so I would be sentimental and trusting enough to sign my life away. The sheer weight of the betrayal started to take a toll on my body. I stopped sleeping, my mind racing through every conversation we'd had over the last year, looking for more lies. I stopped eating because my stomach felt like it was full of lead. I lost weight, and my eyes became sunken and dark. Adrian watched this transformation calmly, almost with a sense of satisfaction. He wasn't worried about my health. He was waiting for me to fully unravel so he could use my physical decline as more evidence in court. He wanted me to look like the unstable woman he was describing to the world. One night, as I watched him drink a glass of wine by the fireplace, I realized that the war we were in wasn't emotional at all. For him, our marriage, our daughter, and my life were just variables in an equation. It was a strategic game of chess, and he was waiting for me to make a desperate emotional move so he could call checkmate. He wanted me to scream, to cry, to break things. He wanted a scene. That realization was my turning point. If he wanted a war of strategy, I would give him one. I would stop being his victim and start being his opponent. Instead of confronting him again or pleading for the truth, I went completely silent. I stopped the accusations. I stopped the crying. I even started to smile again, though it felt like a mask made of stone. I acted cooperative, even helpful, around the house and the office. I let him believe that his gaslighting had worked and that I was finally defeated and broken. During this period of quiet, I was doing two things he couldn't see. I was working with my lawyer and the forensic accountant to pull apart every layer of his financial crimes. And I had quietly, carefully reached out to two of our oldest board members, people I had known personally long before they ever joined the company, presenting them with the early evidence of what he had been doing. I saw him relax, his guard slowly dropping as he grew confident in his total victory. He started leaving his laptop unlocked for longer periods. He stopped taking every single phone call in the garden. He went back to his arrogant, comfortable self, convinced that I was no longer a threat. That was his biggest mistake. He forgot that I was the one who built the marketing arm from scratch. He forgot that I was the one who negotiated the hardest contracts with the most ruthless investors. He forgot that I knew how to play a long game just as well as he did. While he was celebrating my collapse, I was quietly gathering every scrap of evidence he thought he had erased. Silence wasn't my surrender. It was my camouflage. While I was playing the role of the defeated wife at home, my lawyer was working closely with the forensic accountant to unravel the full scope of Adrian's crimes. We gave them every bank statement, every tax filing, and every digital footprint we could find. They spent weeks digging through the layers of Sinclair Urban Development's finances. What they uncovered was a mountain of evidence. It wasn't just offshore transfers, though there were plenty of those. We found false debt entries where Adrian had claimed the company owed money to entities that didn't exist. We found inflated liabilities that made our profit margins look smaller than they were. It wasn't just a simple betrayal or a husband trying to get a better divorce settlement. It was massive systemic fraud. He was stealing from the company, from our investors, and from the government. He had been so focused on painting me as the villain that he hadn't realized he was leaving a trail of breadcrumbs that led straight to a prison cell. Every forged signature and every moved dollar was a nail in his coffin. I sat in my lawyer's office, looking at the charts and spreadsheets, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. The climax of his plan arrived when Adrian scheduled a formal board meeting to finalize my removal from Sinclair Urban Developments. He had it all mapped out. He would present the documents I signed at the restaurant, mention my recent instability, and have the board vote me out for the good of the company. He walked into that glass-walled conference room with the air of a king about to be crowned. He didn't know that I had already secured the forensic evidence. More importantly, he didn't know that the two board members I had quietly reached out to in the weeks prior were already on my side. I had shown them the proof of his siphoning, and they were horrified, not just by his treatment of me, but by the fact that he was putting their own investments at risk. As Adrian began his presentation, I sat at the end of the table, perfectly calm, and dressed in my best suit. I watched him lie with such ease it almost made me sick. He thought he was closing the lid on my career, but he was actually walking into a room full of people who already knew he was a thief. The night before that board meeting, Adrian made one final desperate move. He tried to move the remaining company assets, the last of our liquid capital, into his hidden holding company. He thought he could empty the vault before the unstable wife could do anything about it. But my lawyer had been waiting for exactly this. We had an emergency freeze order prepared and filed the moment the transfer was initiated. A targeted block on that specific transaction to catch him in the act and preserve the evidence. When he tried to execute the command on his laptop, he was met with a denied message. He tried again, his face turning a dark, angry red, but it was too late. The system was locked. The freeze hadn't ended his fall, it had just kicked it off the cliff. He spent the rest of the night pacing the house, his composure finally beginning to crack. I stayed in my bedroom, listening to his heavy footsteps, feeling a strange sense of peace. He had spent months trying to make me feel like the ground was disappearing beneath my feet. But now, he was the one standing on a ledge. The trap he had set for me at the restaurant had finally snapped shut on him. He had underestimated the woman he thought he had broken, and that was a mistake he would never be able to fix. Finally, we were back in court. It was the same room where he had smiled at me months ago, but the energy was completely different. This time, I was prepared. My lawyer didn't just defend me, she went on a full-scale offensive. The forged narrative Adrian had built, the story of the crazy, unstable Naomi, collapsed under the weight of the forensic evidence. We presented the offshore accounts, the false debts, and the proof of his systematic siphoning. Then came the final blow. The audio clip from the video of the waiter. When Adrian's own voice filled the courtroom saying, "You were paid to serve food, not warn her." The silence was deafening. Adrian's face changed in an instant. For the first time since this nightmare began, I didn't see arrogance or control in his eyes. I saw fear. He looked around the room, searching for an escape or an ally, but he found none. The judge looked at him with a mixture of disgust and disbelief. The man who had tried to erase me was now being erased by his own words and actions. I sat tall in my chair, watching the monster crumble. The collapse of Adrian's world happened with a speed that was almost dizzying. Based on the evidence we presented, a criminal investigation was opened immediately. An asset seizure was initiated to recover the funds he had siphoned into his holding company. The board of Sinclair Urban Developments didn't even wait for the trial to end. They met that afternoon and removed him as acting director with a unanimous vote. His carefully crafted composure shattered publicly in the hallway outside the courtroom. He wasn't the calm, collected genius anymore. He was desperate, shouting at his lawyers and trying to blame everyone but himself. He looked smaller, older, and pathetic. He had gambled everything on the idea that I was weak, and he had lost. The public reckoning had begun, and the man who had tried to steal my empire was now watching his own turn to ash. I walked past him without saying a word, the sound of my heels on the marble floor the only response he deserved. I had spent months being the victim of his psychological warfare, but I was the one who was still standing. The press coverage of the scandal exploded. Headlines were filled with words like fraud, asset manipulation, and spousal financial abuse. Adrian tried one last-ditch effort to save his reputation. He gave an interview where he tried to blame the stress of the business and even tried to blame me for forcing his hand. But the evidence was too overwhelming, and no one believed his lies anymore. He had lost the court of public opinion just as badly as he had lost in the legal court. People who had turned their backs on me began to reach out with hollow apologies, but I didn't need them. I had learned who my real friends were in the darkness. Adrian's empire, the one he tried to steal from me, was being dismantled piece by piece. His name, which he had valued above all else, was now synonymous with betrayal and greed. He had tried to make me the cautionary tale, but he had ended up becoming one himself. The woman who ignored the warning had become the woman who finished the war, and the world was watching her win. The final and most important battle was the custody decision. This was the moment I had been most afraid of, the reason I had fought so hard. The judge reviewed the evidence of Adrian's manipulation and his attempts to use our daughter as a legal bargaining chip. The ruling was swift and decisive. Primary custody was granted to me. Adrian's financial access was severely restricted to ensure he couldn't hide any more assets. Best of all, my full control over the company I co-founded was restored. We were in the same courtroom where he had smiled so smugly months ago, watching my life fall apart. Now he couldn't even bring himself to look at me. He sat with his head down, a broken man who had lost the only things he ever truly cared about: power and money. I held the legal papers tight to my chest, feeling the weight of the victory. My daughter was safe, my work was mine again, and the man who tried to destroy me was finally powerless. The cost of ignoring that note had been everything, but fighting back had given me my life back. Almost everything. Maya never called. Of all the people who had turned away during the worst months of my life, she was the only one who never came back. No message, no explanation, no apology. Just silence. Some wounds I was learning don't close the way you expect them to. A month after the final ruling, I went back to that restaurant alone. I sat at the exact same table where the nightmare had begun. I ordered the same wine we had shared on our anniversary. This time, I didn't look at a menu or a phone. I watched everything. I watched the way the staff moved, the way the shadows fell on the walls, and the way the guests interacted. The manager, the same one who had lied to me about the system glitch, approached my table quietly. He looked nervous, the same darting, restless eyes I had noticed the first time I came back asking questions. There was no glitch, he admitted in a low voice. He paid me a lot of money to erase that footage. I'm sorry. I looked at him and gave him a small, cold smile. I know, I said. I didn't need his apology or his confession anymore. I had the truth, and I had my life back. I sat there in the candlelight and realized that I would never ignore the signs again. I was a different woman than the one who had sat here months ago. I was stronger, sharper, and far more dangerous to anyone who dared to cross me. As I finished my wine, I thought about the waiter. I still didn't know where he was, but I knew he had tried to repay a debt or perhaps just do the right thing in a world full of people like Adrian. Adrian thought that by making me ignore that note, he had cost me everything. In a way, he was right. I lost my innocence, my trust, and the version of my life I thought was real. I lost a friend I had known since before I was anyone's wife or anyone's partner, and that loss had no court order to fix it, no forensic evidence to explain it away. I lost something in my daughter too. Not her. Never her. But something in her eyes on that night in the kitchen when she asked why Daddy smiled and Mommy didn't. Children carry the fractures of their parents' wars quietly, privately, in ways you can't always see and can't always reach. That is the cost no verdict covers. But what Adrian didn't realize was that he had also taught me how to fight. He had stripped me down to my core and forced me to discover the iron underneath. He thought he was destroying me, but he was actually forging me into something unbreakable. I paid a terrible price for my lesson, but I would never be a victim again. I walked out of that restaurant into the cool night air, feeling the strength in my own stride. I had survived the setup, the betrayal, and the psychological warfare. I had won the war Adrian started. And as I drove home to my daughter, I knew one thing for certain. I would never lose again. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end. Please take a moment to like and subscribe to hear more stories like this one. There is another one waiting on your screen right now.